If your paycheck, if your network, if your associations, if things that we're benefiting from are bound up in that criticism, then you have no choice but not to criticize it.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up, talk a little bit about what happened at the Supreme Court this week. Then later on the pod, we sit down with Jared Stacy, who has a new book out titled Reality in Ruins: How Conspiracy Theory Became an American Evangelical Crisis. It's a good pod, so stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I am well, and you?
Well, boy, howdy, do I have some news for you.
Oh boy, I can't wait to hear this.
I have saved it for this recording.
I love it when you save some info.
Right. Okay, so you do know that yesterday I went to the doctor because of some neck and shoulder pain I've been having, right?
I do recall
You do know
I do
this?
recall this, yes.
Okay, so this has been going on for almost 6 years now.
Yeah.
Finally decided to get it looked at and get it
Yeah.
taken care of.
Yeah. I mean, why get it checked out immediately or
Immediately.
even after 3 years?
Why would you do that?
You would wait till 6 years.
Of
That
course.
makes perfect sense.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I went, I did x-rays and everything. And long story short, part of my spine is not aging the way it's really supposed to. And I imagine this is not an uncommon problem.
So you're a pain in the neck.
Yes. Whereas you are a pain in the, yeah. Anyways, so two of my vertebrae are kind of not aging right and they're squeezing some nerves, which is causing a lot of nerve pain. Anyways, but the first course of action to try to take care of this pain
Right?
is around muscle relaxers, physical therapy, and some pretty strong steroids.
Oh, wow.
So I asked
Okay.
the doctor, I was like, oh, she asked me if I'd taken all this before. And I said, yeah, taking steroids for sinus infections and things like that. And she was like, oh, no, this is different.
Uh-huh.
She's like, these are a lot stronger than what you take for sinus infection. I said, oh, are these the kind that make you mean? And she said, yes.
Oh, geez.
So
Oh, my gosh.
Right.
Where am I going to be going?
here's the thing. So for the next week or so, I get a full pass.
No.
Not only that, but we are heading into my birthday week, which means you even exponentially cannot complain and have to be nice.
So, okay. So, how about the first 30 years of our marriage? Were you on steroids then, too?
Right. I did ask her, I said, you mean this is going to make me meaner? And she was like, oh, you're not mean. And I
Oh.
thought,
Oh.
you should talk to my husband. Anyways, yes. So you have been put on notice
Oh, boy.
that for the next week,
I'm going out of town. I got to find something else to do.
so that starts today.
Okay, wonderful.
You have been warned.
Oh, okay, well, yay me.
Right. So anyways, that's the breaking news I bring to the pod. What about you? Do you have any other bad news?
Well, as you know, there's all kinds of things happening in the world, but specifically this week, something came out of the United States Supreme Court that just makes me facepalm, to be quite honest with you, because the Supreme Court ruled that a law in Colorado was unconstitutional. Colorado passed a law recently that banned conversion therapy for minors. And conversion therapy, as many of our listeners know, for those who don't, is a practice that is conducted by primarily Christians to convert or to I don't know what you say. To
Pray the gay away.
Yeah, basically pray the gay away. Yeah, to take a child or a minor adolescent who is gay and counsel them to become heterosexual.
Straight.
Yeah,
yes.
it's just. And so they made their decision based upon the notion that somehow the law prohibited the free speech of the therapist. And it just is mind-blowing to me.
That's a lot of mental gymnastics to me.
It is. Absolutely it is. And it's just, it goes, this court, in my opinion, is out of control. They continue to perpetuate this idea that there are no consequences. You can say and do anything you want unless it goes against their values. And I don't know. I'm just at a loss, to be quite honest with you.
So my thought is, we've kind of talked about this since the decision came down and about the free speech of the therapist, kind of if you're going to take that angle with it. My thought is that a therapist, if you're a licensed, educated therapist, you should be bound by medical ethics and research. I mean, valid research,
Right.
which would mean you can't adhere to the idea that being gay is a choice
Yeah.
and you can pray it away.
Right.
So that's where I'm having a hard time reconciling. And what's frustrating is that I'm sure there are all kinds of quote unquote therapists out there who aren't of that ilk, maybe, who exist within church spaces, faith-based spaces, who are able to counsel people. And that's where that kind of comes in. That's a different kind of ethical issue in who is able to conduct therapy.
Right.
So I don't know. And I don't know all the details of the case, but that's just my first thought, that a therapist who's trained, who's licensed in a science-based field should be bound by science-based evidence.
Right. Yeah, and what we do know about conversion therapy, that, it is widely claimed that it is harmful in the way it is conducted and should not be practiced. It's discouraged by, all the associations that have credibility, that oversee therapy and counseling, but it's this minority group of Christian counselors primarily that want to continue this practice. And I've had this argument with some fellow pastors who are conservative, who still think that being gay is a choice. And I have told them, said, listen, I disagree with you wholeheartedly on that issue. But here is what I'm trying to tell you. Even though you may think that it is a choice, this practice of conversion therapy is causing horrible harm to adolescents, to the point where they're causing self-harm. Some of them are, coming to the brink of suicide. Some have made the choice of suicide. And it's like, this is what's happening.
Right.
Why won't you acknowledge the fact that this practice is harmful? And and now the Supreme Court has legitimized it and said, press on, you can keep doing it and keep causing harm. And it's maddening. And again, I believe with all of my heart, this Supreme Court is absolutely out of control.
So this actually kind of ties into our conversation today with Jared Stacy, who has a book out called Reality in Ruins: How Conspiracy Theory Became an American Evangelical Crisis. And in the book, he does actually address some of the LGBTQ policies and laws that have come to be as a result of conspiracy theories. But before we get to the interview today, we talked earlier after we read the book about some of the crazier conspiracy theories over the years. And when I was doing some professional Googling, I stumbled across something I'd kind of forgotten about, but I thought it would be a great opener before we talk to Jared.
Okay.
Do you remember the name Peter McIndoe?
I do not.
I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Okay. Do you remember the birds aren't real conspiracy?
I do remember that.
Okay. So I got to reading more about him. I mean, I knew of it, and I don't remember how I knew of it or anything like that, but I went kind of reading more about it, and I watched one of his little TED Talks, or maybe been TEDx, I'm not sure. And I'm hoping that the magicians behind the board can link this TED Talk, because if you've got a few minutes, it's 13 minutes, but it's fabulous. So Peter, in 2016, he had grown up in Arkansas, in a land where conspiracy theories run wild, and also evangelicalism, is very...
Shout out to Dr. Kevin Hefner at this point.
Right. And so he, kind of perplexed by this and wanting to explore the effects of this, started this campaign or this conspiracy theory called Birds Aren't Real. What he claimed was that the U.S. government replaced all birds with surveillance drones between 1959 and 2001. He went about to doing this to try to see if he could get the media attention and to see what happens. And he did. And, he did it kind of saying, a couple of the points he made were really funny to me. He said, think about it. You never see baby pigeons. They're always adult pigeons. How does that happen? And then he says, and these birds, he said, they're obviously standing on the power lines because they have to charge their batteries. So he made several points where you're like, all right, I can see how you'd connect those dots.
Right.
But it largely gained traction also because of the quippy sayings, as conspiracy theories kind of do,
Sure.
which is, if it flies, it spies.
Oh, nice.
And then the other one I loved was, bird watching goes both ways. So you could see how this could, gain attention. The people who protested and who showed up, were kind of in on the bid.
Mm-hmm.
But what was so interesting to me is the first part of his little TED Talk, he talks in character. He says, he was playing this character, and he comes out explaining this conspiracy theory, giving this, his quote unquote evidence for it. And then he stops and he restarts as himself. And he kind of walks people through why he did this. But the interesting thing to me, and, the point to which Jared makes in his book, is he said, when I started getting recognized by people who didn't believe my conspiracy theory, they would approach him with anger and vitriol, and, they couldn't believe it, and they would just come at him very aggressively. And he said, I was playing a character. And he said, but I wasn't taking in those words and those sentiments as my character. He said, I began to internalize those personally.
Right. That's interesting.
And so he talked about how he realized in that moment why it's so important not to confront conspiracy theories in that way. And I thought that was such an interesting point that he made, as somebody who he knew what he was saying wasn't true. He was, playing this character. Yeah. But yet when people came at him with, hate or disgust or contempt, that he felt that in his own true self. Yeah. And so I just thought it was such an interesting lesson to learn. And, as we got this book, I mean, I got to admit, conspiracy theories just make my head hurt. It makes me so frustrated with people. And so I don't know what I was expecting out of this book, but I really loved the way Jared kind of presents how we got here. Right. And he says, in the beginning, he says, this isn't a reference book. It's not filled with techniques or tips for winning arguments with friends. It offers little ammo towards shattering the illusions of family members or friends captive to conspiracism. He says, so if you're reading to win, you've already lost. So at that point, I got mad and just wanted to put the book down because, I wanted to read to win. But he just said, this book is for those who know the agonizing alchemy of pain and panic created by conspiracy theory and are looking for a solid place to stand and people to join. Yeah. So I just thought, with Peter's experience and kind of the way he explained it, and again, check the show notes for the link to the TED Talk, it was so helpful to look back throughout history and talk about why conspiracy theories take hold. And spoiler alert, a lot of it comes from white supremacy and from, slavery. Right. But also, of course, we know it's fear-based, but he really unpacks history and kind of ties it all in and helps us to understand the roots of it, which I think is so helpful as we do try to combat this type of thinking. Right. Yeah, so I really enjoyed the book. I enjoyed kind of the building the historical basis from the foundation and understanding the hows and whys we got here, because I think it's going to help everyone in how we move forward.
Absolutely. So Missy and I will be right back with Jared Stacy to talk about his book, Reality in Ruins: How Conspiracy Theory Became an American Evangelical Crisis. We'll be right back.
It's the voice of the turtle. Actually, you're hearing my voice. I'm Brian Henderson, Executive Director of the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists. But Voice of the Turtle is our new podcast. The year 2026 brings some uncertainty for our LGBTQ+ siblings and allies. But we've been here before. Across 8 episodes, we're going to burrow our way through some of our history and talk to the people who made it and are still making it.
The churches that invited them to come speak to them also faced harassment in the general community. So we're talking about real bravery and real dedication.
I remember sitting in a coffee shop in Fort Worth, Texas, working on this lecture, when it suddenly dawned on me, we are so limited by the questions we ask about queer and trans people. And so I decided at that point just to ask a different question in my lecture. And the question I asked was, what do churches have to learn from queer people about relationships and covenant?
In those early days, there weren't very many of us. For me, today, there's hope in that there's so many more of us.
Voice of the Turtle was the name of an LGBTQ plus newsletter produced by Baptists in the late 70s and into the early 80s. Voice of the Turtle's motto was, "Behold the turtle. It makes progress only when it sticks out its neck." Our podcast, produced in partnership with Good Faith Media, will honor the lives of those who courageously stuck out their neck, whether as an ally to or member of the LGBTQ plus community. Join us in April and May as we stick out our necks together to see how courageously we may keep moving forward today. We'll drop a new episode each Thursday, beginning April 9th. From the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, in partnership with Good Faith Media, it's Voice of the Turtle. Listen, subscribe, rate, and stick out your neck. Learn more about the podcast at goodfaithmedia.org.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Jared Stacy is a post-evangelical theologian, ethicist, and former pastor. He received a PhD in moral and practical theology from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. His research focuses on the intersection of theology and politics. Jared has a new book just released titled Reality in Ruins: How Conspiracy Theory Became an American Evangelical Crisis. Jared, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Mitch, Missy, thank you for having me. This is great. Thank you. It's really, really glad to be joining you today.
So, Jared, I have a confession.
Yeah.
You about lost me in the very first pages of the book when you said, if you're reading to win, you've already lost. And so
By God, she's ready to win.
I was about done, but I'm glad I stuck with it. I very much enjoyed it.
The scary thing is, I think that's in the intro.
It
That's
is.
nice.
It literally was like the first 60 seconds. So I was like, all right, I'm done. Tap it out. But before we talk specifically about the book, we need to begin with your story. It's kind of important. Sure. You grew up, in a fundamentalist offshoot of evangelical Christianity, used King James translation, had purity culture, all the things. For even further context for our listeners, you shared that your church was concerned when you decided to go to Liberty University because they were afraid that would turn you liberal. So let's all take a moment to sit with that thought.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
Okay. So
It's a
set
spectrum.
the stage for us a little bit more about your background.
Sure. I mean, from the time I was young, I went to an independent fundamentalist church. Some of your listeners will know.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I included the Liberty bit is because it sort of locates where we were.
Right.
But I also went to a grade school that was affiliated with Moody Bible Institute. So much more adjacent to like touching the Wheaton area of evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm.
And then went to Liberty, and then I was in the SBC. And so that was the trajectory. But growing up, I really experienced what in the book I call totality. And as a child, we might even say that might be helpful in some respects, right? Because I got mutual reinforcement everywhere I went. And that in general can be a helpful thing when what's being reinforced is healthy. But in this case, I'm looking at the areas of that totality where, anti-science or like elements of misusing archaeology to sort of quote unquote prove Christian faith. As these are things I talk about inside of that. And so it was always very much normal. A part of growing up, there was this antagonism. There was this sense that those who are outside, and let me put it this way, there was this sense that every church I drove by as a kid, I was sort of trained to think those aren't real Christians, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was constantly saying these, and even at my non-denominational school, right? Like there was a sense, well, Presbyterians, oh no, those aren't, and no one sits you down and tells you these things.
Right.
They're in the air in fundamentalist Baptist circles that I was in. And so this wasn't like anyone was sitting me down and telling me this. This was, so that's sort of to locate where on the register. And I think I mentioned in the book, Westboro Baptist, which is kind of the flagpole fundamentalist in many people's minds who aren't like familiar, they were extreme.
Mm-hmm.
That was extreme.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a spectrum.
Yeah.
It really was. And so that's sort of locate, where it was and how it functioned, right? It was in the air. Yeah. A lot of it wasn't sitting down and telling me, but it was formative all the same.
So there's a couple of things there's several things in the beginning that you kind of use as jumping off points for the discussion of the book that I want to talk about a couple before we go deeper. One you mentioned earlier, which is totality. I'll get to that in a moment. But the one thing I thought was so interesting that you brought up was the knowledge doubling curve.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you tell our listeners what this is? Do you remember the dates and
I
facts?
do, yeah.
Okay, 'cause
So this is the work of Richard Buckminster, and this explains a lot of our moment, and the reason why you and I open up our phones and we're just overwhelmed with information. It's why the current war in Iran is disorienting, because we can't even cipher and scroll through enough facts. So this concept really has to do with how much information is on offer and how much information is being produced, right? So what he theorized was, and I don't exactly know all the details that we don't have time to get into on this
Right.
podcast, but his basic contention was that humanity's knowledge was basically doubling in production. And he estimated that at the beginning of the 20th century, before the First World War, right after the American Civil War, that humanity's knowledge maybe doubled once every 100 years. By that point, it had been doubling every 100 years, and that increased, right? Well, by the middle of the 20th century, he was starting to say, well, maybe it's every 25 years that humanity's knowledge is doubling. Now, estimates range, and this is a very open concept, between 12 to 24 hours, right? So for your listeners, just to put this to scale, right, there's research that suggests from the time you woke up to maybe the time you go to sleep, that the total information that we've produced as humanity has doubled.
Wow.
And that's beyond, our terabytes to be able to
Right.
capture. It's just this overwhelming, I use the metaphor of a river, right? It's just this torrential flood. And that knowledge doubling concept has a way of just sort of setting what the stakes are, that the problem isn't just bad information, it's also too much information, that our brains were not designed to process this amount of fact data. It's overwhelming us, and that leads us to seek out some shortcuts to make sense of it all.
That reminds me of the old saying, Jared, that Shakespeare was closer to Jesus than we are to Shakespeare, culturally, educationally. I mean, even today, that might change to the fact that we may want to bring that to Dickens or even to Tolkien.
Right.
That Tolkien was closer to Jesus than we are to Tolkien, and that was 100 years ago. So, yeah, amazing.
Yeah, that was really wild. I hadn't heard, you hear about information overload, but hadn't heard it in those terms before. But the second thing I want to talk about, you mentioned earlier, is the totalities and story in particular. You give a great example in the book of being, walking into someone's hospital room as a chaplain, and how that kind of how the totalities and stories are important. Can you kind of give us either that example or a different example of what this means?
Yeah. So in general, when I'm talking about totality, I'm just talking about the experience of the world as sort of a bounded whole, right? The sense that it's comprehensive, and that comes with it also the sense of control or certainty, right? That we know what's going on. And so, totality shows up in the way that we narrate the world around us. It helps us interpret, and I use helps because it is somewhat of a crutch, right? That if we were living in a perpetual state of uncertainty, that requires and asks a lot of our brain processing power. So, totality shows up in the minuscule and also in the macro. And it's just this experience of the world as something predictable, something we come to expect. You could also look at neuroscience and this is layman's terms, but upstairs, downstairs brain, right? Where you have your daily processes, our brain's telling ourselves to breathe, and you weren't thinking about it. I wasn't thinking about it until I mentioned it. Those sort of processes run automatically. And I think that's what makes the book difficult sometimes to realize, is when we're talking about totality, it's something that we're all swimming in. This experience of reality is a bounded whole. And I try to cash that out in my work. My vocation right now is as a hospice chaplain. I'm doing this scholarship, and I'm also like in people's homes during the week, and I'm reading people's medical charts. And one of the great things about having chaplains a part of hospice care is that I exist as a way to sort of remind our team that these are people, that the people are not the chart, and that we need the data on the chart, but someone's story is so much more than what we're seeing on the chart. And we all know this sort of reflexively, but when it comes time to contending at scale with the problem of like myths or disinformation and conspiracy theory, oftentimes we end up focusing on sort of just the chart, on the quality of the information in front of us, which I talk about in the book. That's not a bad thing. It's not a total dead end, but it is limited in what we're able to do. And I apply this, specifically towards my own community, right? That I can't tell my story without it. And there's a lot of ways in which I think that's sort of the responsibility of us who've come up and have been influenced adjacent to this sort of very public, very successful movement. White evangelicalism has been wildly successful, even as we try to define it in ways that justify all those sorts of things. Getting down to totality is my way of kind of saying it's not enough just to dismiss people by saying, well, you don't live in reality. Well, they're still experiencing and operating in this totality that sometimes, and I say this in the book, fact checking is like, you can't penetrate that. It doesn't get through to when someone's already experiencing the world as a set of a sort of storied, bounded whole, like, oh, everything makes sense. Right. And I'm going to continue because this is comfortable, because this provides security. And what I found as a pastor was that when you start to attempt the fact-checking measures, what you really find out very quickly is that you're triggering a crisis of faith, right? That it wasn't just about narratives of exclusively Democrat sex trafficking with QAnon. It was that narrative was at the cutting edge, and at the heart of it, though, was really a claim about who Jesus was in the world and what good, faithful Christians ought to or should be about. And so that's my way of defining the crisis too in the title, is saying like this is something that involves disoriented, malformed faith.
So another theme of the book, Jared, is holy paranoia. And so if you could define that quickly for our audience and tell us how that plays out in the world.
Sure. So holy paranoia is the name that I give to the unique totality that is and perpetuates inside of white evangelicalism. And it's my way of also introducing theology as both problem and solution, right? The problem being that it's a Christ, a vision of Jesus split between this myth of America, white supremacy, unbridled capitalism. We could pour a lot of content into that container, but Jesus as a mascot for those myths and movements. And then also a Jesus that is somehow loosely tied to the cross, the things that we commonly associate with what it means to be Christian, but they're associated, and there's a transfer of authority from the Christian story to this particular way of understanding what America is, what it should do, what it has been, and more importantly, who gets to run it.
And you mentioned this in the book, and you talk about how all of a sudden you had this conspiracy of a stolen election merging with this holy paranoia that culminated in January 6th. So talk a little bit about that and your reflection upon that day.
Yeah. So that's probably where this holy paranoia really can converge and be seen for what it truly is. And, in our culture, the dominant way of talking about January 6th, holy paranoia is my attempt to sort of shatter that binary and have a different conversation. Because if the only options on the table are, well, it was an insurrection, which again, I've just put all my cards on the table. Politically speaking, yes, it was an attempted coup. Like I'm not middle weighing this, but the only culturally available options for interpreting it are political insurrection or comically a tour gathering, right? And we are in a moment where that's winning out. That's winning out. I think we need to be able to say that. But the other question is then, what is the church's language about this? And I'm trying to get back on the table. January 6th was a prayer rally. This was a distinctly Christian event, and no way of redefining who the real evangelicals are is going to get the church off the hook for the need to talk about January 6th in theological language, to really do theology against theology. And so holy paranoia really at the heart of January 6th is a Jesus who both endorsed the big lie, and I include a bunch of different tweets from evangelical leaders who were stumping for it, who were suggesting, oh, we should pray, even if they're not going to endorse election fraud narrative exclusively or explicitly. Oh, we should pray. There's a lot of power in invoking that sort of action and it brings Jesus right to the center of it.
Yeah.
And so that the confusion that holy paranoia manifests, not just in an intellectual sense, but also with every conspiracy, that the cash out is sort of, well, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
You know, if the election was stolen, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And so I tell the story in the book of how the church I was at the time, and I had already left, so there was no way of knowing this for sure. But there were buses in the parking lot, right? January 6th was like a local event. And so I knew people who were either associated with it or were there. And of course, you know, this is an event where so many people were caught up in a mob, a fifth column that was sort of wielded beyond maybe what they expected. But that's precisely the point, is that wielding religion as a sort of cover for these things. And so, but at the heart of that, holy paranoia is my way of saying there's really a Jesus at the heart of this that is animating and justifying this movement. And no amount of posturing, no amount of redefinition is going to absolve Christians in this country from having to talk about that, and to do so in ways that do theology against theology.
Something you said is so important, that, you know, examining any of this causes a crisis of faith. And for so many people, that's the harder path. So it's easier to kind of slide down this path of it getting crazier and crazier. And you mentioned things like, you know, Pizzagate and, you know, the things that came to fruition on January 6th. It's just easier to go that route than to really look and examine, because the crisis of faith is just not tenable for some people.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I would be the first, because this was part of my experience, is that going down that path is very costly, in that if your material vocation, right, if your paycheck, if your network, if your associations, if things that we're benefiting from are bound up in that criticism, then you have no choice but not to criticize it. And so that's where I sort of position myself in the book as, you know, I describe myself as post-evangelical, but that's not a distance making measure. That's my way of saying, like, I'm doing theology without distancing, or without saying I'm never, and will have nothing more to do with evangelicalism. Like, post-evangelical is saying someone needs to say sorry. Someone needs to take up this work. So post-evangelical, yes, like, I came out of this, but I'm also, because I came out of it, I'm also still part of it, in the sense that it's my story and my past, and I can't exercise that. I can't cut that off. But insofar as now I'm no longer directly within an evangelical institution, I do think that offers itself as a unique form of being able to tell the truth in ways that institutional logics or other commitments just have a way of sort of bending and warping, you know, how we make sense of things. And I'll be honest, you know, in doing some of this work, because a lot of the book was distilled from my PhD, and a lot of what didn't make it maybe to the surface in the book was a lot of the theological work, particularly, and I cite him a couple times, Hans Ulrich, who passed away actually just this month, and his work went, you know, right into this book. He was a theologian who came of age in post-war Germany. So his insights into how to do theology in a time where a rising generation was coming to grips with a cultural memory in post-war Germany that didn't really wrestle with the Nazi influence. I'm not drawing a fine line of connection here, but I'm also raising the possibility that, you know, there are willed forgettings, and greater attention to the American story shows, we've done this before. By we, evangelicals, we've forgotten what we've endorsed, the movements that we've given license to. And I think in some ways we're already starting to see that sort of forgetting bubble to the surface.
Jared, in the book you wrote, if what you are is biblical, then you can never consider how you might be wrong. Do you think that plays a huge part in humans' propensity to buy into conspiracy theories instead of facing the reality before their eyes?
I think so, especially when what we're talking about is faith, right? A lot of the fact-checking activism sort of look at religion as a pathology that is on par with conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And I would say, for people, because I talk with people all the time who really are, for reasons of integrity, on their way out the door of the church, and are trying to maintain their integrity on that way out, right? And who would say, well, these people believe fairy tales, and of course they're going to believe this. And to that, I kind of say that's where I think the pressure actually belongs, is the scandal of what Christian faith is, and how Christian faith makes itself credible in the world is not always through reasoned arguments of a historical quality, but it's love. It's this existential act. But in this time, and what goes into that statement about, well, if you're biblical, you can never be wrong, is just this endless cycle of justifying ourselves that I think the world outside of evangelicalism like sees through pretty clearly, especially when it comes to just parts of hypocrisy that we kind of chalk up to, well, they're just angry, or those aren't really us, that's not really our people over there doing those things. But that adjective biblical is so powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you're able to ascribe that to yourself, and I talk about this in the book, like we don't have to talk about this in a partisan sense. We can talk about it in a theological sense. If you're claiming the label biblical, the same as evangelical, as a sort of way to escape or avoid any criticism or accountability, then what might be going on is that we're claiming the knowledge of good and evil for ourselves. Like we're claiming to be the ones who draw that line, and nothing could cut against the grain of the Christian story more than claiming we possess the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
That's what the story of Eden was always about,
right.
Was man and woman seizing that knowledge for ourselves.
Yeah.
But somehow we've made it about 6 days, and not the more forceful teaching, which is humankind claiming to be what we're not.
Yeah.
And that sort of humility, I think, is what an encounter with Jesus should actually provoke.
Absolutely.
Is a sort of immersive uncertainty.
So while we're on the topic of the Bible, and I'm going to try to ask this next set of questions very carefully.
Sure.
As we've gotten older, I think we're all kind of in the same space here. I think you had a lot farther to go than maybe we did. But as you begin to think critically and look back at the teachings of your faith or your religion, realizing the amount of what we learned was based upon a mythological understanding of the world.
Mm-hmm.
How, or would you potentially say that religion, and in particular Christianity, is little more than a conspiracy theory in and of itself?
I'm really glad you brought this up, because I've heard that from both ends. Like I've heard that from the end of belief, like staunchly Christian saying, well, after all, Christianity is a conspiracy theory, and then kind of cash that out into vaccine denial. It just gets cashed out all over the place. And I've already said I'm more aligned with non-Christians who raise that point than I am with Christians who willingly associate Christianity with a conspiracy theory. And this book like sits right in the middle of that pressure cooker.
Yeah.
And I say from the very beginning in the intro, like I'm still a practicing Christian. Like that's maybe the scandal of the whole book, is that it doesn't cash out into an exclusively psychological pathologizing of religious people. And on the other hand, it suggests that, well, maybe Jesus delivers us from our Christianity. and so that those sorts of ways of talking do ruin reality. And I think when we look back on our inheritance of how we read the scripture, and also how scripture has been used. I mean, I didn't talk about this in the book, but part of my own story is when I came out of pastoring, I couldn't read the Bible for maybe 6 months to a year afterwards. Mm-hmm. Like the grooves that had been overlaid in my experience in my life, it was just a very difficult book for me to open up and recognize any sort of authority lying under. And so like this question of like, well, isn't Christianity conspiracy theory? I think there's two ways at that. And whether it's asked from belief, I'll answer a resounding, like, we should not associate Christianity with a conspiracy. But that also raises the question, well, how does Christian faith made credible? And that's the question that I would ask to the Christians in the room, right? Listening. how is Christian faith made credible? Is it made credible by, anything but love? But then to those who ask it from a sort of a posture or position, whether of atheism or being agnostic, of Christianity is just a conspiracy theory, I'm fully prepared to see that scandal of, I don't have any way to make this credible, other than to live a certain sort of life. But I'm not going to argue the historical existence of Jesus. Because even if you, me, Mitch, were to get in a time machine and go back this week, we're recording on Holy Week, even if we were to go back and witness some of these things, witnessing it as a historical event doesn't make anyone a Christian either. And so, but that's what I believed as a kid. Like, if I could just have some morsel. So did I get to the heart of the question?
I think you did. But what's interesting to me, you said, the credibility of Christianity. But the problem for me, and you addressed this so well in the book, is that what the foundation or what has made Christianity credible within our country at its core is white supremacy. And you talk about revivalism and how that's baked in. And so that, I think, therein lies the problem, is what brings it credibility in this moment in time and in our context. And what does that here is flawed. And so you just kind of have to take everything down, tear out the foundation, and see what's left to build back. And how do you let it regain any sort of credibility in your life that has any sort of moral and ethical value?
Yeah. I mean, if I could make a biblical or theological argument, because so much of what the book is doing is like doing theology against theology, like absorbing the malformed militant Christian nationalism, which is just as theological as it is ideological. But if we're talking about the ways that Christianity is made credible, like Scripture talks about the church as Christ's body. But unfortunately, the way that we consider Christianity made real in this country is by America looking a certain way. And that's a theological problem that we're not really grappling with to scale. And maybe one of the reasons that is because if we truly started to do this, churches would close, pastors would be fired. All the premises that sort of undergird what it means to do church, survive as the church, are sort of upended because suddenly we don't really have a stake in this making America great again. And so there's a ruin. I mean, really a ruin involved in that path.
My head hurts.
So Jared, you mentioned a moment ago, you're still a practicing Christian. You have not given up hope quite yet. But you talk about finding this new narrative. And so what new narrative are you living out? And how would you encourage our listeners to find their new narrative?
That's great. Well, I think one of the things that I'm discovering is the ways that aesthetics, art, beauty are formative. And this is something that doesn't really play well when you've been raised in the Protestant tradition, but it doesn't really play well with that sort of focus on preaching, on sort of intellectual formation. And so it's one of the reasons why I was really encouraged that the artist Makoto Fujimura endorsed and read and endorsed the book, because his work into sort of changing these metaphors from culture war to culture care has been, I think, very transformative to my way of thinking, that art, that making, that creating can in and of itself be illuminating. And the last in the last chapter, I quote, before I get into just wrapping up the book, I quote the Irish poet Pádraig Ó Tuama, who his struggles with coming out of Ireland and all the political strife involved in that, but then also struggles inside the church. I once had a friend who got on to me because I read too much nonfiction and not enough fiction. And that was back when I was a pastor. I mean, I was just
sure.
It was his tons of nonfiction. And I think discovering that when it came to making sense of a lot of my experiences that I've had, it was fiction that did the trick.
Yeah.
It was finding out that there are stories that name things with such a truth that nonfiction can't capture, and it doesn't make it any less real or true. So when it comes to like finding our story, I mean, I'm very attracted to the idea that beauty, that sense of attraction, is sort of it sort of precedes our ability to even give language to it, that we're drawn to something. And then only then, after we find ourselves participating in it, do we have the language to be able to describe, wow, this is what's been healing about this. And I think if I'm resting that in my story, my life thus far, it was what I encountered leaving America, going to Scotland, and finding a community of people in Aberdeen. So that would be the other thing I would say, is not just the aesthetic of it, not just the beauty of it, but also the belonging. And people seeking out a belonging where whatever story binds that community together gives a story a sort of credibility that can be explained in no other way than here I am beloved, here I belong, and together that I didn't mean for this to be as alliterative it is, but this is beautiful. And our ability to use language to that, it's the second thing. The first thing is that welcome. And I think we're seeing this around us too. Like the cultural stories, the books that are being written, the stories that are being told of hope and not despair and cynicism and fate. I think there's something to that. I really do.
We agree. Well, Jared Stacy, thank you so much for joining us this week on Good Faith Weekly. The book is Reality in Ruins: How Conspiracy Theory Became an American Evangelical Crisis. You are welcome back here anytime, my friend. But before we let you go, we've got one last question for you, and Missy has the honor of asking it.
So, Jared, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
More to tell. Can I do two things? Is that okay?
Sure.
So my first more to tell is, this is an ongoing conversation. Like everything about this book, like demands that we keep talking about it. The minute that we stop dialoguing and we get into our corners to fight to win is when we've lost, right? So I would say I'm on the internet. Yeah, I write on Substack, but I would also love to hear from people if this is like a lived problem, right? And not that I have answers to fix it all, but it's also the sense that the more that we dialogue, the better this is. And then the second thing I would say is this, is getting to be the end of the day, and we live in Florida, and Artemis 2 is going up today to go to the moon. And I think we need to be able to tell people like what we're excited about. I'm excited about that. I think it's really cool. There's a lot of things going on in the world, and that's not to distract from it. But I do think that watching humanity kind of push things out and going farther than we've ever gone before is something to get our attention in a world that is certainly caught up in a lot of despair.
Well, Jared, thank you so much. Appreciate the conversation, and congratulations on the book again. Once more, it is titled Reality in Ruins: How Conspiracy Theory Became an American Evangelical Crisis. You're welcome back anytime, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to our audience, we want to thank you for joining us again this week. Missy and I will be back next week. And until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5. And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.